pursuit of a better life sometimes takes the form of immigrating to a country which offers better job opportunities and economic independence. Sometimes it takes the form of avoiding persecution in the home country and immigrating to one with more freedom and respect for fundamental rights. But sometimes immigration goes into the dark aspects of forced transportation of labor to meet the economic targets of a colonial power which aims to own its human resources rather than pay them for their services. Welcome to The Why in History. I am Ajay Kaul, and today we take a look at immigration through history, its modus operandi, and the impact it had on the economy and the polity across various regions of the globe. Though humans have been migrating across nation boundaries for a long period of time, but between the middle of the 19th century and the middle of the 20th century, cross-border immigration really took off. And the primary reason for this was, one, the Industrial Revolution, which opened up employment opportunities in new industries, and the advancements in shipping, along with the construction of the Suez Canal, which enabled transportation of goods, services, and human resources from Asia and Europe across the Atlantic to the Americas. During this period, there were three primary circuits across which a bulk of the immigration happened. The first one was from Europe to the Americas, which accounted for about 55 to 58 million immigrants, and about 2.5 million of these came from India, China, Japan, and Africa. The second circuit was Southeast Asia and South Pacific, and the immigrants into this region came from India and southern China and accounted for between 48 and 52 million immigrants. About 4 million of these came from Africa, Europe, Northeastern Asia, and the Middle East. And the third circuit was the Manchuria, Siberia, Central Asia, Japan circuit, which accounted for about 46 to 51 million immigrants, and most of these hailed from Northeastern Asia and Russia. In 1861, during the American Civil War, the demand for workers in the war industries increased. And to fill this void, Republicans and President Abraham Lincoln contended that the immigrants were key to replenishing these streams to repair the ravages of internal war and its waste of national strength and wealth. Under the Lincoln administration, Congress passed the Homestead Act of 1862, which offered land grants to both U.S. citizens and immigrants who were eligible for naturalization and who were willing to settle and develop the land for 5 years. In 1864, the Act to Encourage Immigration, or the Contract Labor Act, was passed, and it allowed private employers to recruit foreign workers, pay their transportation costs, and contract their labor. As the demand for labor increased further in the United States, in the year 1868, the U.S. Minister to China, Anson Burlingame, negotiated the Burlingame-Seward Treaty that ensured that Chinese citizens could emigrate to the United States. Emigrate meaning leave China and enter the United States as permanent residents. Previously, it had been illegal under Chinese law to emigrate to the United States. As a result of this, as Chinese immigrants joined the flow of immigrants into the US, the foreign-born population rose to about 14.4% in 1870. Now, as the Civil War ended, the rate of increase of the demand for labor ebbed a little bit, and Congress took this opportunity to look more closely at the naturalization laws in the country. Specifically, One ethnic group among the immigrants became a topic of contention when it came to the immigration laws: the Chinese immigrants. And the core contention was that the Chinese labor was creating unnecessary competition in the market, leading to a decrease in wages. Now, to be clear, the Chinese at that time composed only 0.002% of the nation's population. Yet, this section of the labor force was targeted, and the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was passed, which suspended Chinese immigration for 10 years and declared Chinese immigrants ineligible for naturalization. And this was followed by the Geary Act of 1892, which reinforced and extended the Chinese Exclusion Act's ban on Chinese immigration for an additional 10 years. It also required Chinese residents in the United States to carry their certificates of residence, failing which they could be sentenced to hard labor and deportation. And this ban on Chinese immigration continued, and it was only in 1943, when the US was embroiled in World War II and was seeking to improve relations with China, that the ban was finally lifted and Chinese immigrants were given the right to citizenship under the Magnuson Act of 1943. Moving on to the second circuit of global immigration during that time, which was Southeast Asia. And migration to Southeast Asia and lands around the Indian Ocean and the South Pacific consisted of over 29 million Indians and over 19 million Chinese. And most of the migration from India was to colonies throughout the British Empire. While most of the Indian migrants migrated as labor, over 2 million Indians also migrated as merchants to these areas. Now, with the opening up of the Suez Canal, the potential for exports from different regions increased drastically, and the three areas within Asia that became the prime centers for expansion of domestic production towards exports were Burma, which is modern-day Myanmar, Malaya, which is modern-day Malaysia and Singapore, and Thailand. Using the 1913 US dollar as the base, the exports from these three countries increased from 59.5 million in 1871-73 to 919 million in 1936-38. Essentially, a 4.2% annual average growth. Rice comprised the bulk of exports from Burma and Thailand, whereas in Malaya, tin mining developed in response to the innovation of tinned food in the West. This was a fairly labor-intensive industry, and starting in 1905, the spread of rubber cultivation, boosted by the demand for rubber tires for automobiles, gave Malaya what would soon become its chief staple. Tin and rubber exports from Malaya went almost exclusively to the world economy's industrial core, especially the United States. Now, all these three colonial economies desperately needed labor to meet the global demand. Now, Burma, which was a province of India, there were no restrictions on the immigration of Indians until 1938, when Burma became a separate British colony. Immigration to Malaya, too, apart from temporary controls during the early part of World War I, was unrestricted until the 1930s. Thailand, which was nominally independent but a quasi-British colony, did not restrict Chinese immigration until 1932, when residence and permit fees were imposed. And most of the labor to these colonial regions was supplied from two regions of India and China: South India and southeastern China. And the key factors in effect here were the abundance of labor and the geographical distance. Negapatam was the great port of Tamil emigration from Madras, and in southeastern China, Guangdong or Guangdong and Fujian or Fujian were the two regions that supplied most of the labor to these regions. All these three areas had a history of hardship with periodic famine and an excess of available labor. Negapatam, near the port of Madras, was only over 900 nautical miles from Rangoon, the capital of Burma, and about half as far again from Penang, the destination where most Indians came to in Malaya. The provinces of Guangdong and Fujian in southeastern China were only about 1500 nautical miles from Singapore, which was very closely connected to Bangkok. So because of the distance factor, Burma received chiefly Indian immigrants and Thailand mainly Chinese. Malaya, which was about equidistant between China and India, attracted both Chinese and Indian labor. Moving on to Europe. The period from World War I until the late 1940s can be looked upon as an age of refugees rather than an age of migration within Europe. Out of World War I, the collapse of Russia and Austria-Hungary led to two groups of displaced individuals who did not have any governments to represent and protect them. The fallout of the Russian Revolution, the subsequent civil war, and famine forced over 1 million Russian refugees to flee the Soviet Union after 1917. Interestingly, a big chunk of these moved into Manchuria, that was part of China, as refugees. Besides ethnic Russians, this group also included the Ukrainians and Jews, and as a result, the Russian-speaking population of Harbin in Manchuria swelled to about 185,000 by 1922. The other group that crossed into Manchuria post-World War I were the prisoners of war from the Austrian and German armies who had been imprisoned in Siberia and the Russian Far East. And as the Nazis rose to power in Germany, approximately 400,000 people escaped Nazi Germany in the 1930s. Post-World War II, however, the refugee aspect of immigration reduced drastically and the economic aspect regained traction across Europe. Northwestern Europe specifically was economically booming post-World War II. Industrial production increased by about 30% between 1953 and 58, and the native workers in this region became increasingly educated, and gradually they moved up the hierarchy to become white-collar workers. So local workers were no longer available or willing to take up the blue-collar, unhealthy and poorly paid jobs in agriculture, cleaning, construction and mining. So because of this, Northwestern European governments started to recruit labor in the peripheral countries. So the main destination countries were Belgium, France, Germany, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Sweden, and Switzerland, and the recruited foreign workers were expected to return home after completing a stint of labor. So they tended to be granted fewer rights and little or no access to welfare. At the end of this period, most migrants in Northwestern Europe originated from Algeria, Greece, Italy, Morocco, Portugal, Spain, Tunisia, Turkey, and Yugoslavia. Initially, geographical proximity played an important role in the development of specific migration flows. For example, Sweden recruited labor primarily from Finland, UK from Ireland, and Switzerland from Italy. But European governments gradually expanded their zones of recruitment to countries outside of Europe. And this was primarily done because of the division in Europe itself between Eastern and Western Europe. Because of the Iron Curtain in Europe, it was difficult to recruit workers from the Eastern European zones because of various restrictions. And it was because of this limitation that Western European leaders ended up signing agreements with countries outside of Europe to provide labor, and countries like Morocco and Algeria became part of the suppliers of labor to northwestern Europe. And talking about blue-collar labor from outside the country, the United States federal government instituted the Mexican labor program, commonly known as the Bracero program, during World War II. And the intent of this program was to give farmers who were facing severe labor shortage and wage controls during World War II access to Mexican labor under certain conditions. The program established a minimum wage standard, housing protections, and an established terms of return for Mexican workers while the Americans were serving in the military. The Mexican government was allowed to select the participants in this program. In response to political pressure from labor unions, US Congress cancelled the Bracero program in 1964. But they did not provide a replacement option. And since the demand for low-skilled labor still existed, it is here that a jump in illegal immigration into the United States started. Up to and immediately post-World War II, the aim within the United States from a perspective of immigration was the preservation of whiteness. That is, Europeans were preferred over any other races from an immigration perspective. And despite opposition from President Harry Truman, US Congress passed the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952. It increased the quota for Europeans outside of Northern and Western Europe and granted the Department of State the ability to deny entry to those it thought would lower domestic wages. The bill also set a minimum quota of 100 visas for immigrants from every country. One of the very key elements of this bill was the creation of non-immigrant visa categories that exist even today. I'm talking about categories such as treaty trader or investor, that is category E, student, that is F1, and temporary worker of distinguished ability, that is the H1. Since the bill favored Europeans, and because very few were interested in immigration to the US, many of the available visas went unused between 1952 and 1965. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 looked more broadly across the immigration spectrum and devised a lot of categories for legal immigration to the US. The Act created categories of immigrants that included the sons and daughters of US citizens, siblings of US citizens, spouses and unmarried sons and daughters of green card holders within the relationships category. And on the professional side, it included trades like architects, engineers, lawyers, physicians, surgeons, teachers, scientists and artists of exceptional ability, skilled and unskilled workers in occupations for which labor was in short supply, and refugees. 74% of the available green cards were set for family members, 20% for workers, and 6% for refugees. And with the racial and geographical restrictions relaxed, the Act of 1965 saw an increase in the number of Asian immigrants as well as Hispanic immigrants to the US. Geographically, Florida, California, New York, Texas, Illinois, and New Jersey received the bulk of the new immigrants. Now, two aspects of immigration, refugees and illegal immigration, have created some controversy in recent times. Illegal immigration in the US has mainly stemmed from there not being a proper replacement of the Bracero program for unskilled labor. Europe, on the other hand, has a refugee problem, and that has stemmed from political and social conflicts in the neighboring Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Normal citizens escape these conflicts and try to immigrate to a more peaceful nation. Europe on its own has refrained from intervening in these war-torn areas, and as a result, the common citizen has to seek refuge in Europe. The core issue here is that this big influx of refugees creates an economic and social strain on the countries receiving these immigrants, which leads to political backlash, and terms like border walls or deportations become the last resort. And of late, several of the wealthy countries have resorted to a new trend, that is to force refugees and asylum seekers to await the processing of their claims in third countries, or in some cases, like the United Kingdom, set up a deportation scheme with Rwanda, which becomes an alternate destination to the UK for asylum. A sustainable and scalable solution to this problem requires the various nations across the globe to embark on a painstaking combination of diplomacy, law enforcement, and targeted development. But unfortunately, the rhetoric associated with deportation and walls is making better headlines than any concrete solution. And it is on that note that we end this section of the program. On to the quiz section. Question from the previous episode. Which Arab leader did Anwar Sadat call a lunatic and a disgrace to Islam? In November of 1979, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat called Ayatollah Khomeini a lunatic and a disgrace to Islam. So the answer is B, Ayatollah Khomeini of Iran. Question for the current episode. Which US president signed into law the Simpson-Mazzoli Act, which granted amnesty to more than 3 million immigrants living illegally in the United States? Was it A, Ronald Reagan in 1986, B, Barack Obama in 2011, C, Jimmy Carter in 1978, or D, George W. Bush in 2003? Once again, which president signed into law the Simpson-Mazzoli Act, which granted amnesty to more than 3 million immigrants living illegally in the United States? Was it A, Ronald Reagan in 1986, B, Barack Obama in 2011, C, Jimmy Carter in 1978, or D, George W. Bush in 2003? The answer will be provided in the next episode. That's all we have in the current episode. In the next episode, we look at the global spice trade and how the appetite for spices drew various trade routes and influenced the global trade and economy. Till then, stay safe and keep looking for the why in history.